so pretty much our whole department is here. It's like under 100 people. It's a nice small apartment. It's about like 30 students. Yeah. No. Did Tara? Yeah. That's like marker. Yeah, so we are in our department working the gender ratio. So yeah, the rest of the school is like 80. So you don't have a female, and we're
It's like this is part of a class too. Like they're all in a seminar class. They have to at least write down questions, even if they don't ask them. You know, like that's so many of them.
I'm not even on social media. I don't know what they use. TikTok. It's like your tattoos.
Buddy, can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know. I don't know if they actually can hear me. Okay, there we go. Hey, folks. Welcome back. Hope everybody had a good break and you're psyched to be back for the last week of the semester. Before we get started, which we're going to do momentarily, does anybody have any announcements? Leanne, Professor Whitney, sorry.
We're excited to announce that Ocean Studies will be hosting our annual study break. So every year, the Monday of finals week, we gather in Harborview and we do something. So this year we'll be decorating salted cookies, eating popcorn, hopefully listening to the jazz band. So come to Harborview from 12 to 2 on Monday of next week for a nice little break study. An email will go out very soon.
Awesome, thank you. Any other announcements? Okay, doesn't sound like it. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Abby Barrows. Abby is a marine research scientist focused on aquatic plastic pollution and the owner-operator of Deer Isle Oyster Company, an oyster and kelp aquaculture business here in Maine, based in Deer Isle, nearby. She's earned a Bachelor of Science from the University of Tasmania and a Master of Philosophy and Human Ecology from the College of the Atlantic down in Bar Harbor. Abby has directed global microplastic pollution research since 2013, developing the most diverse and largest known data set available to date. She continues to conduct fieldwork and is actively involved in plastic pollution education. She's currently designing and developing plastic-free aquaculture gear for oyster and seaweed cultivation, and we're going to hear some about that today, as well as her career doing microplastic research. I've known Abby since about 2010 when we overlapped a little bit at a place called the Shaw Institute in Blue Hill, and it's a real thrill to have her back here today to hear about what she's doing now. So welcome, Abby.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Carrie, for inviting me over to Castine. All right, I have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to try to breeze through some of the slides. There should be a little bit of time at the end to ask questions, and if you have something burning that you don't want to ask in front of the group, just come up and ask me afterwards. So today I'm going to talk about plastic pollution in general and my research pertaining to microplastic pollution and some of the work I've been doing as an oyster farmer to combat future pollution. Just so we're all on the same page, microplastics are a pollutant that has emerged as an issue of international concern. They are defined as a piece of plastic between 1 micron and 5 millimeters in size. And it's really important to think of microplastics as a suite or a class of contaminants because they're diverse. They come from many different products and polymers, and they all have the shared characteristics of being non-biodegradable. They absorb and release chemicals. They fragment, but they don't disappear. They come in many different shapes, sizes, and colors, with microfibers being the most commonly found in our environment. So unfortunately, microplastics have been found in all of the world's oceans, from the surface to the deep ocean trenches. They've been found in freshwater environments, tap water, bottled water, beer, agricultural soils, honey, table salt, the list goes on, seafood, birds, human placentas, men's testicles, breast milk, and in our air. The more places that we look for microplastics, the more places we find them. Microplastics are generally divided into two different categories, and both have different regulatory aspects. The primary microplastics are these nurdles, or these pre-production little plastic pellets, and these are transported around the world to manufacturing sites where they're melted down and molded into a final product, like a takeaway fork or something like that. The microbeads are added into personal care products such as face wash or toothpaste as an exfoliant or a filler. These are now banned in many countries around the world, but they still are in some of our pharmaceuticals, and there's some loopholes that they still are in everyday household products. These primary microplastics directly enter the environment through spills, in the case of nurdles, or through our household wastewater, in the case of microbeads. The secondary microplastics are the predominant type of plastic that we find polluting our environment. These are small pieces of plastic that have come from larger pieces fragmenting over time, such as fishing gear, bottles, bags, textiles, and this happens through mechanical and chemical degradation. Another significant contributor to secondary microfibers and microplastics appear to be our clothing. So each time we wash or dry our synthetic clothing, so your favorite running shorts or your polyester hoodie, they shed into the environment, both into the water and into the air. And each washing machine can release thousands of microfibers each load, resulting in an estimated 500,000 tons of microplastics from synthetic clothing ending up in the ocean every year. So a significant contributor. So unfortunately, when microplastics are consumed either directly out of the environment or indirectly through consuming prey or food that contains plastics, the toxicants that are from and on plastic can leach into the animal or the human and find a permanent place in our food web. We've also discovered that microplastics can move through the blood membrane barrier and enter into different body systems. Studies have shown associated behavior change, reduced reproduction, energy uptake, and diminished offspring performance in animals that have ingested microplastics. We know that they can have long-term individual, population, and community-level impacts. We're still, though, just beginning to understand what that really looks like. It's estimated that we're eating around 1/2 pound of microplastics and breathing in about 1/2 pound every year. So if you want to think about that as basically you're eating a credit card's worth of plastic every week. The impacts of environmental exposure to microplastics on mortality, morbidity, and the reproductive success of species continues to be investigated, and we need more young researchers going into these fields to better understand this. Ultimately, all these questions are really concerning because we don't still understand the long-term effects of ingesting microplastics, either on human health or animal health. So a little bit more about my career. Back in 2015, I did a food web study at the Shaw Institute, and we analyzed commercial seafood species. So we looked at mussels, both rope-grown and wild-caught, oysters, clams, lobsters, and mackerel, and we found microplastics in 96% of the samples, with the average number of microplastics per gram of tissue across all the species being 2.5. The lobster and mackerel had much more of the larger microplastics, and not surprisingly, the bivalves had smaller microplastics. So although microplastics research has been a really fast-moving field over the last 10, 15 years, there continues to be a lot of questions. And one of the first steps in furthering my understanding at that time was looking at how we collected and quantified microplastics in the marine environment. So at the Shaw Institute, I conducted a field comparison study looking at the two different sampling techniques that were commonly being used. The paper demonstrated that the traditional and more often used technique for sampling microplastics, that surface plankton net over there on the right, gave us a density estimate for microplastics that was 3 orders of magnitude lower than using the grab sample technique. That's just scooping up a bottle of water there. So relying solely on the Nustinto samples would have resulted in a gross underestimation of the amount of microplastics in the sea surface. Also, the grabs technique easily lent itself to citizen science because it's easy to build in quality control measures, which is really important in this field of research, and has a simple protocol, and the equipment's really affordable. Conversely, the Newson net is like a $2,000 piece of equipment, and you also need a big enough boat to be able to tow it. So now that I had the solid methodology and some information about what direction I wanted to go in, I wanted to learn more about the sources, composition, and distribution of microplastic pollution in the oceans, rivers, lakes, and streams worldwide. So in 2013, I approached and partnered with Adventure Scientists. This is a nonprofit organization based in Bozeman, Montana, and we launched the Global Microplastics Initiative. In 2015, we expanded into global freshwater environments and began a 2-year study in the Gallatin watershed in Montana. They primarily managed the citizen scientists, and I ran all other aspects of the projects and set up a little lab in Sturrington to process those samples. At the project's conclusion, we made a short video that will explain more about the organization and the project.
Years ago, we scooped up a half liter of water locally, brought it back to the Institute. Looking under the microscope and seeing all these technicolored pieces of plastic led me to think of all of these larger questions. How is it affecting the ocean? Our drinking water? Are microplastics everywhere? But I couldn't answer those on my own. So this is when I partnered with Adventure Scientists. Adventure Scientists is a nonprofit organization that unites explorers and scientists to solve some of the world's most pressing environmental issues in which access to data is crucial to resolving them. I work with adventure scientists to train adventurers who would be collecting data for me around the world.
I'm about to take a microplastic sample.
I was able to get water samples from the Antarctic and the middle of the Pacific.
We're going to send this into the labs.
Through the process of working with adventure scientists, I was getting closer to understanding the magnitude of this issue. After analyzing thousands of samples from around the world, we concluded that 74% of them contain microplastic pollution. Microplastics are one of the largest pollution problems that you've never seen. Without adventure scientists, I would have never been able to even dream about this breadth of data that I've been able to collect. The adventure scientist model lends itself to so many different projects, whether it be microplastics, or forestry conservation, or animal protection. This is just the beginning.
Survey results after that study, more than 80% of our volunteers have taken steps to address plastic or microplastic pollution in their own communities. Really proud of that, and also having the ability to reach and work with so many different people felt really unique in the science world that we're often so siloed and we don't get to have these global collaborative efforts. So that was really exciting as a scientist to be able to be involved in that project. I'm just going to run through the results pretty quickly from that global initiative. Each point on this map shows a spot where a sample was collected. The size of the bubble indicates the quantity of plastic, and then the color indicates whether there was plastic or no plastic found. It's really important that there were some samples that did not contain plastic, not just because it's nice not to find plastic pollution, but it also meant that our adventurers weren't contaminating every sample, that we had strong QA/QC in the field. We collected over 2,500 samples. About 1,400 of those were in the marine environment. We found an average of 12 pieces of plastic per liter of water. And over 1,000 freshwater samples were collected with an average of 1.3 microplastics per liter of water. And 90% of those plastics that we quantified were microfiber in shape. The majority of those were invisible to the naked eye, so less than 1.5 millimeters in size, which is a size that is smaller than those captured in the majority of surface studies because of that reliance on the Newston tow net. The fibers go through those nets. For the marine, the other big takeaway from the study was that the data show that microplastic concentration is higher in the open ocean than along the coastal environments, which was a little surprising, with the highest concentrations found in the polar oceans. This has been further validated by other studies, as the polar zones are sort of these dead-end zones where plastics gets trapped in. But also, as you can see, the samples are really spatially diverse, and that is also due to that 1 liter grab sample only really giving us a very small snapshot of the surface waters. I hopped on another research expedition sampling along the Hudson River, where we collected over 142 samples with the Rosalia project, and they come along the Maine coast every summer and do a lot of coastal and island cleanups as well. We did micro FTIR, which is a material characterization of those fibers and things that we found. We found that half of those things that we quantified were actually plastic, and the other half were non-plastic but of anthropogenic origin, which I thought was really interesting. So everything from cotton and wool. Here is a heat map of all the sampling locations and the average microplastics per liter found at each sample, at each spot. As a scientist, I was really hoping that this map would be this like beautiful blue at the top, this remote area like tier of the clouds. You had to hike in for that sample, and then slowly get red as we go down towards New York City and near the wastewater treatment plant areas. There's no relationship between fiber abundance, wastewater treatment plant location, or population density, which just goes to show you can have the best hypotheses and they might not come true. But that really also highlighted how air transport is a component of microfiber pollution. We did find, though, that the Hudson River's watershed drainage area contributes an average of 300 million anthropogenic microfibers into the Atlantic Ocean every day. Shortly after that, I did a small study on plastic contamination in bottled drinking water for a nonprofit called The Story of Stuff, which is a great resource for educational videos. I looked at 19 different brands, and 18 of the 19 contained particles with an average of 8 pieces of plastic per liter of water. So we do know that bottled water on average contains more plastic than tap water. A larger international study that was being done at the same time looked at water bottled from 9 different countries and found microplastics in 93% of the bottled water, with an average of 10 pieces of microplastic, with one brand containing over 10,000 pieces of plastic. So, yeah, the study had some, they're comparable. I had the opportunity through my career to get on a lot of different expeditions and travel to different parts of the world and talk about plastics and sail into beautiful spots. Unfortunately, all those spots seem to have one thing in common. They all were covered in plastic, which I guess is the downside of being a microplastic scientist. But it also made me realize that plastics and climate change are intrinsically linked. Every step of plastic production, from extraction to disposal, contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. And also, plastics generally their low density means that the fragments can easily be picked up by winds and blown around the world. There's been a lot of studies that have been coming out recently about that. We also know that airborne microplastics can absorb or scatter sunlight and ultimately influence temperatures on the Earth's surface. It's still pretty new science, and the conclusions are kind of tricky because unlike other aerosols, the microplastics come in all those different shapes, sizes, and colors. It does appear that microplastics could have localized cooling or warming effects depending on how they vary from place to place and their density. And for example, there's higher concentrations over cities. There's a lot still to be learned here. And in order to further investigate airborne microplastics and ecosystem interactions, I traveled to Alaska a few years ago and then the Antarctic Peninsula a couple winters ago. I did a study in Prince William Sound, also called Glacier Alley, and the methodology was based on ongoing Arctic research, and I collaborated with some Canadian microplastic scientists to help round out one of the Arctic food web studies they were doing. I also collected sediment and water samples and glacier ice, grizzly bear scat. Some of those samples are still being processed. I also had this great idea of sampling salmon guts. But it's a great idea in my desk from Maine, and then I go to Alaska and I realized it was a spawn, and salmon don't eat anything during the spawn. So there was nothing in their guts. So an example of how you can have a great project idea, and then when your boots are on the ground, it might not actually pan out. I did a PHA degradation study with 5 gyres, which is being touted as like the new biopolymer, to look at marine and terrestrial degradation over a year and a half of them being in those environments. From that study, that was also done in Florida and California, they created the Better Alternatives Now list, the ban list, through the 5 gyres website. You can access that. And it really shows that the majority of bioplastics or degradable plastics really don't actually degrade in the marine environment on this timeline. So there's a lot of blue washing out there and green washing out there about that these are, marine biodegradable plastics. During that time, I made a short little film with a rock climber called named Sasha DeJulian for Outside TV, and this just a little short clip.
That's not as dramatic as I thought it would be.
The coastline of Maine is beautiful, rugged, and hosts an impressive ecosystem that the people who live here care for.
You are like the most badass person I've ever met.
Erin and I are going to meet up to learn how Abby and other local businesses are trying to protect their home state through sustainable practices, science, and aquaculture.
So I had an awesome opportunity to go to the Antarctic Peninsula with National Geographic and Lindblad. And I originally had this study idea to look at how tourism is impacting localized microplastic pollution. I had to reframe it. I had a lot of raised eyebrows. No one wanted to touch that, even though I'm like, you're National Geographic, don't you want to get ahead of this? So I reframed it, and they said, yep, come on this expedition. And so I assessed the atmospheric load of microplastics across the Drake Passage, so from Tierra del Fuego in southern Argentina to the Antarctic Peninsula, about 500 miles, and evaluated how tourism and tourist ship-based microplastics may be contributing to local pollution loads through proximal air and water sampling. Ultimately, I was asking what are the types and concentration of microplastic pollution in the air and the water across the Drake Passage and on the Antarctic Peninsula. We collected 24 water samples, and this is sort of a homemade kit based off some other researchers' sampling apparatus. It was really simple, a tube that I put in the water, and it had 3 stacked filters, 104, 212, and 500 micron filters in there. And then I just connected it to a battery and pumped it into buckets and did quality control measures in the field. I had 38 onshore air samples, so I went to the spots first and put air samples upwind and downwind of where the tourists sort of walk. And then I had 15 onboard air samples on the bow, stern, and inside on the boat. Our findings, we're in the midst of getting that peer-reviewed and published right now. It shows that the need for the tourism industry to adopt mitigation strategies and offer some efforts to reduce contamination in Antarctica and other similar remote regions. Those ships actually produce a lot of plastics. And if you can ever get down there, I suggest you hop on a boat to do so. Last year, I went to Raja Ampat with the Oceanic Society in collaboration with Plastic Pollution Coalition, the Drifters Project, and S.C. Johnson. It was 10 days, and we sailed all through Raja Ampat Archipelago in the middle of the most biodiverse region on the Earth, the Coral Triangle. It has over 43,000 square kilometers of land and sea, with most of the islands being uninhabited. And much of it is a marine protected area, so a really remote part of the world that you would think wouldn't have a lot of influence by humans.
I came on this trip to sample microplastics in the water column and also sample for atmospheric microplastics as we travel around remote areas of Raja Ampat. There's a lot of questions that we still have about how wind and air currents are transporting microplastics around the world. So for testing air, we have an air sampler on the bow of the boat, and the idea is that that is collecting an environmental sample that's unfettered by any of the contamination coming from the boat. Then we have a midship sample up on the mast, so that is probably getting some of the environment and some contamination from the boat. And then we have a sample on the stern, potentially sampling all the stuff that can be coming off the boat and into the natural environment. So with these 3 stations, we'll have a comparative study between the different areas of the boat and also a snapshot of what's happening here in Raja Ampat in terms of microplastic pollution in the air.
So that study was really interesting. The data was really lacking, which tells us something, but it still felt very head-scratching compared to some of the other studies that have been done there. And it was really difficult to discern any patterns or draw any very strong conclusions from that study. There were differences in particle morphology and material type across the different matrices and the sites. But it really highlighted the need to further evaluate microplastics in this area to better understand sources, environmental abundance, and fate. My thought, too, was that because there's so much marine diversity and abundance, that a lot of those water samples, that plastic might already be taken up by corals or fish or some of the marine life there. Yeah, I suspect that the numbers really do not reflect the true microplastic abundance in those areas of Raja Ampat. So maybe an excuse to go back and do a repeat study. Now I'm going to change gears. During a lot of my research, I also started running an oyster farm and learning a lot about small business and how to integrate some of my research and knowledge about plastic pollution into aquaculture. So in 2015, I purchased what is now called Deer Isle Oyster Company. I had no business background at all. Just in hindsight, it was kind of foolish. But you know, when you have no idea, sometimes you do some fun things. One of the reasons I was drawn to purchase an oyster farm with no business background and no experience on an oyster farm was because I live in Stonington, and the working waterfront is a really important part of our community. I also see that having a diversified waterfront is essential for the future of having that community. And so the opportunity came up, and I was like, hey, maybe this is a way to model a viable business for people to supplement their fishing career or as something to pivot to as the Gulf of Maine continues to change and the all lobster industry becomes something different than it is now. I also recognized that there was a lot of pressure on global fish populations and that the demand for seafood continues to increase. So this also felt like a sustainable local seafood that people could have access to. So in 2015, I purchased the farm and started working out of a rowboat on the weekends and in the afternoons after being in the lab all day. So I suggest doing stupid things like this when you're young, because then you have the energy and capacity to work like 60 to 80 hours and not think about it. But I noticed, there was a lot of things I had learned in those first few years. And I attended a lot of conferences and talked to a lot of other aquaculturists, and everyone really promotes the industry as not not only doing no harm, but actively doing good for the environment. From carbon sequestration in seaweed, from increased water clarity and quality from filter feeding, and how consuming these products is a responsible source of protein and nutrients, to name a few things. Oyster and seaweed aquaculture techniques do really tread lightly on the environment and are beneficial to the ocean in many ways, but that's the animal. It's not the infrastructure that we have built around these industries. These industries rely on plastic. As you can see, here's a pile of plastic on my boat that I'm about to put oysters into to put out into the water. Every step on the cultivation of oysters rely on plastics. And all of these plastics have the same end of life, either landfill or lost in the environment. And around here, we don't really incinerate them, which is a mixed bag anyhow. And we know that about 8 million tons of plastic waste enter the ocean each year from mismanagement. So to visualize that, that's about a garbage truck of plastic being dumped in the ocean every minute. And by 2050, our landfills will host over 12 billion tons of plastic. And unfortunately, all of these plastics will eventually fragment into microplastics. I'm going to talk about what I've been trying to do to maybe change this a little bit, maybe mitigate this a little bit, at least starting with my own farm. So ever since getting into oyster farming, I've been wanting to have my research background overlap with what I do out on the water. And this has led me to reimagining what aquaculture could look like without plastic. So in 2021, I got a little grant and named a project called the project Rethinking Plastic-Based Aquaculture and Investigation into Viable Materials. And we sought to identify durable, competitive, viable, and ecologically friendly materials for aquaculture systems with a focus on oyster cultivation. And at the most basic level, our goal has been to figure out what materials are best for the job, performance, supply, scalability, and that also meet our ecological goals. So turns out R&D in the marine environment is really hard. You can't do that in a year of grants. So we're in year 4 of doing R&D on the water, and we've had a lot of different setbacks. We've learned so much. We've played with so many different materials: cedar, cork, salt mesh, stainless steel, aluminum. Keep on coming back to trying to produce gear that is environmentally friendly and is designed which is accessible and scalable for other farmers. As part of the project, we have partnered with other farms up and down the Maine coast to do side-by-side trials with plastic and plastic alternative gear to compare oyster growth and also collect some metadata, so salinity and temperature. Because each site has a lot of different environmental pressures on it, and it's really important to see how the gear holds up in these different environments. We also have a way of doing a rapid assessment of how the gear is holding up using a rating system. We also have, our biggest stumbling block has been figuring out flotation. The first year we used cork, so this cork from Portugal, not very scalable, renewable resource, but not very scalable. We've got this nice linseed-based paint. That's the yellow going on there. Linseed-based paint is like $80 for a pint this big. Like an entire pint went into one of those. It just like absorbed it all. So lots of learning curves, being like, okay, that's just really not affordable. We've played with different mineral finishes from oyster shells, ground up oyster shells, and painting on rubber mastic. We played with calcium silicates and nanocellulose silicates, different components. We've learned a lot. We've lost a lot of gear. Luckily, it's all biodegradable. We've also been wanting to try some kelp-derived finishes. In 2023, we expanded our prototypes to be better compatible with more farm setups. So most people around here do surface culture often use these aluminum ranches or oyster grow systems. So you can put 4 bags in one of these ranch systems. It also maximizes your real estate as we're getting more and more pressure about space in Maine, even though we still have a lot of space. That's becoming more of a thing that people are talking about. I really like aluminum. You can fix it yourself. It is infinitely recyclable back into the same thing, unlike plastics where you recycle it and it will emit a recycled bottle This is shredded. It will never ever be a recycled bottle. It'll never be a bottle again, right? So it's downcycled, usually one flip before it's the landfill. Aluminum, you can melt it down and make the same thing again and again. The floats continue to be a sticky point for us. And we've moved towards more wood in some of our bag designs. And if we have too much of it, though, it becomes more buoyant, and then the oysters are held out of the water, and then once it's not so buoyant, it has taken up water, and then it's really heavy. So physically, it's a tricky material, but having some component of wood seems to make a lot of sense because it's accessible here. We have eastern white cedar, and it's affordable. So here are more pictures of different prototypes, more different floats in the top right-hand corner there, fouling in the bottom middle there. A prototype we're not going with, but that was fun to play with, and we could flip it so it would sit out of the water, which is really important for cooking off some of that fouling. The fouling organisms decrease the flow of water and ultimately impact the growth and health of the oyster. So you're always trying to find things that can be flipped and air dried or sun dried. This last year we had much higher success in our robustness and workability. Again, though, a lot of it is very physical work and trying to figure out things that have some of those lightweight properties similar to plastic. Plastic is a very amazing material. It's just it'd be nice to find something that doesn't have the same legacy and non-biodegradableness. We have been able to produce a ranch using the welded aluminum for around $250 worth of materials, which is comparable to what's currently on the market for oyster farmers if they want to buy a 4-bay ranch. So that's a really big deal for me, to be able to have something that is within 20% of the same price of what's out there in terms of plastic material. Because the only way this is going to be adopted on a larger scale is if the economics make sense for farmers. So this is one of our latest designs. You can see this is a stainless steel mesh on your right-hand side with less wood, a wood cap and bottom, and those slide into those bays. But stainless steel and aluminum do not like each other. That basically creates a battery in the water, and there's corrosion and deionization that happens. So we put zinc cuffs on the aluminum, and that helps slow that process down. But we're really looking to see if we can find something non-toxic to coat the aluminum and the mesh of the bag in, and just like a lobster trap, that's galvanized, and they coat that in PVC. So that's one thing that we're working on this winter. And also, as tariffs are on the future, on the horizon in terms of importing metals, trying to figure out how we can sort of anticipate what those price changes might be. So this past year we had more trial and error. We really ramped up our micro buoys. I haven't even talked about our micro buoys. So in that suite of different flotation that we've been playing with, the micro buoys I got really excited about. So micro buoys are hemp chaff that has been inoculated with mycelium, and it grows through the chaff in about 2 or 3 days at a warm temperature, and then you sort of unwrap it from this little greenhouse you have created it in. That's a video I should have added in. And then you let it cure, and it creates this hard film or firm film around the micro buoy, and we've played with coating that in all sorts of different things. And we've worked with Sue Van Hook, who is the co-founder of Ecovative in New York, that's been doing a lot of different fashion and design and construction materials out of micro products. Big thing though is that the marine environment's really rugged and really harsh on things. So we've had a lot of failures in that they just don't last as long as we want them to. So we've been really trying to play around with different coatings to increase that longevity. Right? That's the balance of, we don't want something that lasts forever and is toxic, but we want something that can last long enough that it's worth the investment for the oyster farmer. Oh, and we also played around with different more mooring ball shapes of the micro buoys. They're on the far left. with the hopes that we can use those for seaweed farming as well. We also thought, why don't we try making like a lobster trap style float? Looked great, lasted about a day before that thing sunk. So again, trial and error. Cedar's really fun to play with, but not as buoyant when you're trying to hold 300 pounds of oysters in the water. Again, that metal and salt corrosion. We had what we thought were stainless steel marine grade staples, and they were not that. They corroded and the bag fell apart. So again, lots of playing with corrosion and trial and error. So looking forward, we're hoping to continue to expand upon our baseline research in building gear and integrate more natural materials into kelp and seaweed farming, hopefully with the help of a friend of mine who has been developing a viable gear company down in southern Maine. And she's been working with kelp and wool to create a really rugged twine that you can grow seaweed on. As we're seeing more and more seaweed farmers in Maine, it'd be really great to be able to transition that industry into non-plastic materials. This year I'm growing dulse out on the farm, which I'm really excited about, with a mix of plastic and non-plastic gear. We plan to have an open source gear design of this gear available by next winter, once we get through this last hump of the prototype stage, and potentially be in the position to take orders from other farms interested in transitioning out of plastic or starting with plastic-free gear. We're really working towards having plastic-free gear be a real financial and workable option for sea farmers, not just in Maine, but nationally and internationally. I just obtained another lease to grow oysters and seaweed in another cove in Deer Isle, and ideally I would build that from the ground up as a plastic-free farm. I really hope to model what a commercial scale farm could look like for both oysters and seaweed. We're also trying to move away from plastic in other aspects of our existing on-the-water infrastructure. So using we're having a welded aluminum boat built this winter because all bottom paint is plastic, and that sheds into the environment that you're trying to grow oysters in. I would really love to transition into electric outboards. Some of the technology is not quite there for living in rural Maine, but I'm keeping my eye on that. And I would love to also build a mostly plastic-free upweller system, which is a system of pumping water over baby oysters, which helps them grow faster and bring them to market more rapidly and decrease mortality. So we have a lot of hurdles, but in the future we want to see plastic used for growing seed products as the exception and not the rule. And my vision is to continue to pursue disruptive innovation to help change the materials approach to aquaculture and create a truly sustainable food cultivation system. I think that as farmers and stewards, we can do better, and we need to do better. So thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take questions. And I also wanted to say we are hiring at Deer Isle Oyster Company for a farm manager and farm hands for the 2025 season. Thank you.
So folks, if you have questions, raise your hand and I will come get you. Oh. We have plenty of time, so.
When you were talking about the very beginning, where you were getting your samples and such, I heard you say wastewater treatment facilities. Have you ever had an interest or an idea of going to different wastewater treatment facilities and seeing if their outcome water still has microplastics versus their starting water, like how much is lost in the process of clearing it?
Yes, so everyone could hear that question, right? So when I was at the Shaw Institute, that is something we did target. We looked at wastewater outfall pipes in Blue Hill, Stonington. We even came to Castine once, Bucksport, and Ellsworth. Unfortunately, because of health regulations and also politics, it's pretty hard to sample the wastewater before it goes in. That's, human effluent. We were able to sample a lot of the water coming out. Again, it was above the outfall pipe in a marine or river environment, so it was dilute, but there were significant amounts of microplastics making it through the wastewater treatment plant. since then, there's been a large breadth of study done on wastewater treatment plants. And that has shown that depending on what type of wastewater treatment plant, it can actually capture a lot of the microplastics before they make their way to the ocean. But the problem there is that that sludge, which those plastics are often trapped in, is then usually spread over land. And so it's still being put out into the environment. It's just maybe not directly into the ocean. So depending on the wastewater treatment plant, it can capture plastics, or it can actually be a major conduit of point source pollution for microplastics.
So we actually had a student do that very kind of project, and I can script you to it for that.
You mentioned that many types of bioplastics are non-sustainable. Are there any types that are?
I wish I could answer positively to that. I haven't done a recent review of the science, but to my understanding, there is no bioplastic that really stands above the rest. A lot of them maybe have a 10% corn in them, and then they still have many of the same suite of chemicals that are added into plastic, and also have a lot of petroleum in them. So at this point, I have not seen a product that has been a shining example. Nopla and there's Cruise Foam are two companies out of California that are doing some pretty interesting things. I haven't seen what their breakdown is of what they're actually putting into those plastic alternatives, but I feel like we're on the cusp of actually creating something that is maybe a true alternative to plastic and not just a greenwashed alternative.
So there might be some hope then, is what you're
Yeah,
saying.
yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Hello. On the Raja Ampat expedition, in the video, it looked like a schooner or similar tall ship. What ship was that, and is it dedicated to science under sail?
It is not. I am spacing on the name of that style of boat. It is it's based off of a traditional cargo ship that has been used for centuries in that part of the world. It does have sail, but we mostly motored, and it's mostly used for moving people around, not cargo. With Oceanic Society, there are a lot of opportunities to go and do science research in some of the remote parts of the world that they frequent for their sort of educational tours.
Thank you.
Well, I was pleased to see the woodwork in the efforts for plastic-free oyster farming, but my own experience with woodwork says if you don't put a good finish on it, kiss it goodbye in a few months. But most worthy finishes are polyurethane, epoxy, things like that. And you can use that to like sort of seal out moisture and but not get really heavy. It's humid out. Were there finishes that were like, potentially biodegradable and would seal out the wood really well that weren't plastic, or if there's artificial derivatives that are still applicable and biodegradable, like a drying oil?
Yeah. So my husband's a woodworker, and he's sort of been the one doing a lot of the shop work for this. And we have played around a lot with pine tar and linseed, which has been linseed oil, which has traditionally been used in the Maritimes. We did pine tar linseed treatments for our Manila rope with pretty high success. And we did do pine tar on the cedar when that first round of prototypes, and that lasted quite well. The cedar is is naturally anti-fouling, and also very buoyant. But playing more with different linseed coats, different oil-based coats, again though, like that is leaching into the water, and we don't know how some of those things interact with shellfish. We know that any sort of copper-based paint is toxic to shellfish. And we've looked at maybe like shellacs and other things that are natural derivatives, but not with super high success. Thanks.
Any other questions for Abby? Hold on. That's right.
Thanks for the great talk. This is really informative. I'm really curious, actually, methodologically, how you prevent contamination of plastic everywhere.
For the field sampling?
For all of it.
For all of it.
Everything
Yeah,
in the lab
so
is
the
plastic.
microplastics, that was the state of the science when I first started in 2011. I think there were 3 papers out on microplastics. So a lot of it was figuring out, doing the lab work and being like, there's a bunch of blue fibers in this, and there's a blue towel hanging over on the chair over there. So some of that was us through realizing that we were contaminating samples through things in the lab. And then more and more papers started to come out on quality assurance and quality control measures that you could take. So the lab I had in Stonington was a totally plastic-free lab, only glassware, and then I had a white cotton lab coat that I wore that we also sampled as part of our sub-sampling for the material characterization. And in the field, I had fairly strict quality assurance and quality control measures that the adventurers had to follow, with the idea that it's citizen science. There's potential for contamination, but having the sampler not wear synthetics, and if they did wear synthetics, marking down what colors those were on the data sheet. Always having them stand downwind in the sample, because we realized that was also a contributor to their plastic shedding. What else? We had foil put over the cap, so in case there was any shedding if people were using either number 2 or number 5 plastics, that bottle cap was often a mix of plastics, so having that not be in touch with the sample. And then I would rate the samples when they came into the lab. So I had a sort of a rigorous system for going through the samples based on data. We also had photos of the adventurers, photos of the samples taken in the field. So that was another way we could assess what quality level that was. So we would break them into Q1 to Q2 and Q3. And we only used the Q1 data for publication, even though the Q2 and Q3 data was also informative. It was just a little the integrity of the data just felt a little questionable for some of those.
Awesome. What's our time, Carrie?
We're at 3:50.
Okay,
So.
we are at 3:50. So thank you so much, Abby. And a round of applause. And Abby can be here for a couple minutes if you want to come chat about oysters or anything else. And then she's got to go. Take care.